Just got this in from AES Wave. Now I already have one of these fuse jumpers. Got them right there, a whole set. And the reason why I picked up another one is because sometimes you need two of them. Like say you're using the mini fuse and there's a car that has two separate fuses for the fuel injectors. You want to look at both of them at the same time. And the kit only comes with one of each type of fuse, so you need two kits. So I'm really glad to have that. It just helps with diagnosing problems and making things easier. And while I was on AES Wave's website, I picked up this pretty sweet scanner danner magnet. So it's gonna go let's see, just go ahead and put it right here. No, it's blocking the Milwaukee logo. I don't like that. I'll just put it right there. Boom. Tonight in the garage I have this Saturn SL2. I think it's a 2002. This is the one that I actually bought for like $220, and then I sold it to my ex-wife for $220. Just straight up, you know, same price. I didn't make any profit off of it. But it's been having a few issues. The car's been sitting for a while because it wouldn't start. It's a long story, okay, but turns out I went over, diagnosed it, I had a bad starter. He put a new starter on it. The car started right up. But after a few months or so, or just like 2 months or whatever, it seems like the new starter is giving up the ghost, and it was just a cheapo starter. So sometimes it randomly doesn't want to crank over. It just clicks, he says. So we are suspecting that this cheap, like $40 starter is on its way out. So we're going to go ahead and start testing things and just see if we can confirm that the starter is bad. Okay, so I already got the fuse panel open right here. And you can see I got a fuse right there. I've already pulled out the fuse for the fuel injectors. Let's go ahead, connect the scope, and let's see if we could get basically a relative compression test. And let's see if we could see any dead spots on the starter. So I got the scope sitting right there. Let's go ahead and crank it over. Like I said, the fuel injectors are disabled. Alright, so we got something. Let's go check it out. So here's what we have. As you can see, I zoomed in, and the relative compression test is showing that we have a cylinder that's low. And if you listened carefully while the engine was cranking, it does sound like one cylinder isn't really contributing like the rest. The thing is, this car came in running and I got in it, I started it up, and it does not feel like it's misfiring while it's running. Alright, so that's something to think about. Now we are suspecting a bad starter because it randomly doesn't want to crank, and I actually experienced it while I was doing all of this right here. I got in the car, turned the key, and it would crank just fine. All of a sudden, nothing, just a click out of the starter, and then I turn the key again, and it cranks again. So it is very intermittent, but it is there. I did experience it, and I think what we're seeing right here is where you see it drop out all the way down to the bottom, you know, is that signs of a starter that's bad or going bad. Another thing to notice is it's primarily on, okay, so look, here goes our cylinder with low compression, right? There it goes right there. There it goes right there. Right there. Now, every time we get on the cylinder that has low compression, we are seeing that starter drop out on the commutator. So are we getting false readings of a bad or low contributing cylinder because we have a bad starter, and whenever it gets to that spot on the commutator on the starter, it just doesn't have the juice to crank it over, and that's why it seems like one cylinder is lower than the rest? Don't know. It's just a little theory of mine. It's just something I'm keeping in the back of my mind, because when this car is running, and I got in it myself when it was running, you can't feel misfires. It doesn't feel like it's misfiring. It doesn't sound like it's misfiring. So I wonder if we have basically like a false negative here because of a bad starter. I want to go ahead and run this test one more time just to make sure. Whenever I'm doing a relative compression test, I always do it at least 2 times. You know what's funny is the battery on this thing is relatively new, but if you listen to it crank over, it doesn't really crank over that fast or that healthy, and that's kind of a sign of a bad starter. Now the starter that was originally on this car, like I said, I went out to go look at it and diagnose it. That starter was so bad and seized up that when you turned the key, even if you had a brand new battery in it and you had someone else giving you a jump start at the same time to get as much juice as you can into the battery, when you turned the key, the engine cranked over so slow. I mean, it was very slow to the point where I had to take everything apart and confirm that the engine actually rotates and that the engine is not locked up or hydro locked or something like that. That's how slow it was turning. But after checking everything out, I had to come to the conclusion that it has to be a bad starter that's turning slow. And this one's kind of doing the same thing. It's kind of cranking very slow. So let's go ahead and run this test one more time. Alright, so once again, we have that one low cylinder, and you can actually see it right there and right there. But we're not seeing the big dropouts that we had like the first test. You see, so it is slightly different. So it's still showing us we have a low compression on one cylinder. Just for the sake of this, I'm going to do this test one more time. Why not? What's funny is this time while it was cranking, it seemed to be cranking over faster than it was the first time. So let's go ahead and try it again. Okay, so that time it seemed like it was cranking a little bit slower. The second time we did it was the fastest that it seemed like it was cranking over to me. And that time seemed to be, or this one right now seemed to be a little bit slower. And again, look at the dropouts we have. If I get this to focus, I'm gonna go ahead and hit this. Not that it really matters, it's just gonna show us the same information. But look at these crazy dropouts. That is on the starter, guys, okay? That's a bad starter right there. And that's why he's having these intermittent no cranks. See, you get some variables like this whenever you're doing a test like this. So, you know, you could rule that out. Don't worry about that cylinder. But look at these crazy amount of dropouts. And we saw it in the first test. We didn't see it in the second one. But then it shows its face in the third one. And it's actually worse this time. So I can confirm, or I can say with confidence that I'm pretty sure this starter is no good on this car. Now, once we put the starter on, is it gonna fix this, what seems like a low compression on that one cylinder? I don't know. But the thing is, this car cost them almost nothing. Like I said, I sold it to them for what I got it for, so it was like $220. The parts for this car are dirt cheap. He uses it just to get around, you know, puts equipment in it, blah blah blah. It's just like a little throwaway car, right? So I mean, if you could put a starter on it and have this thing starting reliably, and while it's running, even if there is slightly low compression on one cylinder, if the car runs, so I think it's worth putting a starter on this car, because if not, he said if it's not the starter, it turns out to be something major, he's just gonna junk the car. All right, but honestly, I would not worry about that, simply because it runs, and it runs well when it is running. But that right there, it's a bad starter. All right, so one final test, and I know I'm beating a dead horse here, but hear me out, okay? So the final test is with a second channel open, and as you can see, I have my clamp on ignition cable for cylinder number 4. So we're gonna have our sync off of cylinder 4, and the firing order on this engine is 1, 3, 4, 2. So I already went ahead and did the test right here. So you could see the ignition waveform in the green line. Okay, so every time that spike goes up and we get our waveform, that's cylinder number 4. So that means this hump right here is cylinder number 4. The next one in order would be number 2, number 1, and number 3 should be right here. So we have low compression on cylinder number 3, and it's going to repeat itself from here. So here goes number 4 again, and as you can see, it lines up with our ignition waveform. After 4 comes 2, 1, and that thing just timed out on me. There it goes. So 1, and there goes 3 once again with low compression. So we are pretty much done here with the scope. We saw what we wanted to see. We could tell the starter is bad. We know we have a low cylinder, and we now know that it's cylinder number 3. So at this point, what I want to do is pull out the spark plugs and just look at them, simply because the owner has brand new spark plugs here for, you know, a little bit of a tune-up. They're super easy to pull out, so it doesn't hurt to just look at the spark plugs. Got the spark plugs out of the car, and this is the way they came out of the engine. So cylinders 1, 2, 3, and 4, and you can already spot the one that just stands out like a sore thumb. Okay, so the scope is not lying to us. It is indeed cylinder number 3 that's having a misfire. You can see how that spark plug looks different from the rest. Now, why we have low compression, I don't know. and how much time do I really want to invest in this thing, you know what I mean? The fact of the matter is, even though the engine seems to run fine and I really don't feel a misfire while the engine's running, the scope is showing low compression, and this spark plug is just confirming it. So I decided to pull out the cylinder leak tester, and I've already filled up my air compressor, and you can see I got my ratchet right here because I was manually turning the engine over by hand to make sure that we have cylinder number 3, we have the valves closed on it, and it's not looking so good. Okay, so let me go ahead and plug in this air line, and we'll see how much leak down we have. Got the air line connected. You could hear the air rushing through here. You could see on this side we're at 100 psi, but on this side, now I made sure that the valves are closed. Like I said, I was turning it manually until I could get the most amount of pressure, and the highest I could get it is about 30 psi. So the difference between this, which is 70, that's how much cylinder leak down we have. We have 70% loss of compression. And guess what? The engine just moved. You see? Okay, so perfect example. The engine rotated over a little bit. That means the valves opened up and we lost some of our pressure here, okay? But anyway, when it was closed, I could hear all of the air just coming right through the intake valve because it's coming right out the intake system. Alright, so I went ahead and move the engine over again so the valves are once again closed. Again, 100 psi and 30 over here. That's a 70% difference. And let's put the camera right in the intake system and listen. So I hope that's picking up on camera, but it's clear as day. It's the intake valve that is leaking. It's leaking through the intake valve, and it comes up the intake manifold and right out the air intake. So yeah, that's a pretty large leak. I disconnected the air line so we don't have all that noise. You know what's interesting is the numbers. When we were looking at the scope, if I remember correctly, the cylinder that was low said something around, I know it was kind of bouncing around a little bit, but I remember seeing it around 30%, okay? So that would mean it's only at 30% of its compression capabilities, right? And what were we seeing right here? 30%, which equals to 70% loss. Well, the scope is also showing only 30%, which means 70% loss. So I hope that makes sense, and it's kind of just kind of cool how the numbers are adding up, you know, on the scope versus just doing things the old school way, and it's just really neat to see that. But I don't know if this car is gonna end up in the scrapyard now, because the owner, he was saying, you know, with the random no crank, if it turns out that it's not the starter and it's something else, he said screw it, he's just gonna scrap the car, right? And yeah, it does need a starter, we confirmed that, okay? But this is a much bigger issue. Even though the car still drives, and you could probably get away with just leave the misfire because it still drives, right? But what's going to happen when it's time for emissions? The car's not going to pass because it's going to have a check engine light on for the misfire. And what's that misfire going to do to the catalytic converter? More money, right? It's just going to end up causing damage to that thing. So, you know, at the end of the day, if you end up pulling off this head to get those valves fixed, so the head has to go to a machine shop or whatever, right? Of course, it's going to need a head gasket, a complete timing chain assembly. It just gets expensive. And in an old car like this, SL2 Saturn, these cars aren't really worth much to begin with. It almost makes no sense to dump this kind of money into this car. So I hope you guys can see what I'm talking about, and you might even agree with me that I don't think it's worth it. You know what I mean? It's unfortunate because I really like these cars. These cars, they almost go forever. And you know, things like this, it's usually because something happened. You know, lack of maintenance, lack of oil changes, things like that. That's usually what causes failures. I know this one has a lot of miles on it. It's just really unfortunate. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and get in touch with the owner, tell him exactly what's going on, and I'll keep you guys updated. And I just want to point out something else, okay? It's not like this valve that's leaking is the only issue with the car, you know, like, oh, that's the only thing that needs to be done, you know, whatever, I'll just pay to get it fixed, the car be 100%. No, that's not the case here. The car needs other work done, okay? So first of all, the cowl needs to be taken off because he took it off for something, windshield replacement or something like that, and he forgot to connect the line for the windshield fluid. So every time he sprays it, it just kind of dumps out right here. So all this needs to be taken apart to get that fixed, all right? The driver's side window does not go down, and he has a junkyard window regulator here for me and motor to install. Okay, so that's another thing. Think of all the labor. Okay, don't just think of the parts, think of the labor that he has to pay me or anyone else to do things. Okay, the car also needs pads and rotors all the way around. He knows all of this, so another expense. Okay, we have an ignition coil right here. Here goes that regulator I was talking about with the window motor, spark plugs and wires right here. So it's not as simple as, okay, it just needs this one thing, we'll get the valves fixed and it'll be running 100%. No, the car needs plenty of other work. How much work do you want to dump into practically what, almost a 20-year-old car? That, you know, it's crazy. So I hope you guys can see what I'm talking about, that it's, as much as I love these little cars, financially, it just, to me, it's not worth it. I've got the car running and we're at a cold start, so we're at a little bit of a high idle. It's starting to come down already. We're at about 1,000 RPM. You can see we got our service engine soon light is on, so let's check the codes. And surprisingly, we only have EGR codes. We have no codes here for a misfire. I have not cleared any codes. I have not disconnected the battery, and he's been driving a car like this, yet the car isn't flagging any misfires. It's interesting because the whole reason why he's going to get rid of the car is because of the misfires, because in order to fix the leaking intake valve, the head has to come off, right? And he's not going to dump that much money into it. Well, the problem with that is, you could say, well, why doesn't he just drive it? The problem is this car is going to be due for emissions very soon, and if it's throwing a check engine light for a misfire, this car would never pass emissions, which means you have to dump all that money into it to get it to pass. But clearly this car is not flagging a misfire, which is really interesting. And what I mentioned at the beginning of the video is this thing has like the normal jitters that it has. Okay, it feels normal in here. I don't feel a misfire. I'm wondering if this is one of those cases where the low compression, because the valve not sealing, is only present during a really slow rotation, for instance using the starter to crank the engine over, but while the engine's running, the valve seals. I'm sure someone out there has had a case like this, and I'm sure someone has seen this before, but I wonder if that's what's going on here, because clear as day there is a low compression on cylinder 3 while the engine is cranking via the starter, but when the engine is running, you don't feel any misfires, and there aren't any misfires on the scanner. So could this be one of those rare occasions where the owner could get away with putting a starter on this car, keeping the car that it starts reliably, fix the EGR issue, and this car will pass emissions? Okay, so we're coming down on idle. Yeah guys, I don't feel any signs of a misfire here. To reinforce what I'm talking about, I pulled up some misfire data. You can see we got the engine running. It's been running for about 10 minutes now. And look at our current misfires. Nothing, okay? And down here I have history misfires. Nothing. This might be a turnaround point for this car. I'm gonna call the owner, and he may say, you know what, just go ahead, put the starter on it and fix the other little things that it needs fixed, and I'm just gonna keep driving it. So we'll find out.